When we move into thinking about assessment, we need to be very mindful that yes, we need assessment of student achievement, but we also need assessment of teacher instruction and we need assessment of classroom environment, because there is a very important interplay between all of those factors. As principals guiding their teachers in assessment processes, we need to be very canny about choosing wisely, because assessment can take a considerable amount of time and we want the assessment to do what we need it to do. We don't want to waste our time using assessment processes really that don't connect with teacher practice and with time that is not useful. Now, what we know about assessment is that it's not something that just happens at one point in the year. We need to have a very strategic process for keeping students on the radar on a regular basis. For all students in a classroom, there should be some screening of those students at least twice a year. For students who are more problematic, having been identified in that first screening, at least monthly. And for students who really have significant reading difficulties, their progress should be monitored at least fortnightly. We can't afford to wait for these students to discover in the middle of the year that what we believe they had learned has not been kept up, or certainly may not have been learned in the first place. So teachers need to have a continuous cycle of collecting data, which doesn't necessarily mean pencil and paper tasks. We need to move away from the belief that a permanent product such as a piece of paper is the only way of us being able to ascertain students' reading abilities. Because in some instances, how do you do that? It's very much needing teacher professional judgment. But I'd also say at this point that principals need to offer teachers the opportunity to moderate their professional judgment. Because working with individual classes year after year without that opportunity to moderate, we can sometimes lose our way in terms of understanding what's a reasonable expectation for students at a particular year level. We need to have those professional conversations between teachers talking about what they've found and also problem solving that comes out of that. I guess the other thing that we also need to talk about is the seamlessness across a school. A principal has the leadership here in ensuring that the assessment processes used feed each other. That is, the processes that are started in the foundation year of school give data to the teacher in year one to pick it up and continue to develop what those students need. We should be trusting our data from our previous colleagues in earlier years and building on that, and as the skills become more sophisticated, we would by necessity often be layering in more different kinds of assessments because of the sophistication of those students. When we start looking at the different elements of the Big Six, and we go back to oral language because it is the key player here that affects everything else, we need to consider the place of formal and informal assessment. Now, certainly there are some students that teachers readily pick up who have significant listening and speaking difficulties, and they would understandably ask for assistance. But that assistance may not be easy to access, and teachers need to be their own best resource. So principals in supporting teachers in assessing oral language would be, yes, helping them look at what's available in published materials that can be accessed more readily, checklists, rubrics that can help them look at different aspects of listening and speaking and to make decisions about what needs to be attended to first, because we're always going to have to prioritise what we do. And those informal, on-the-spot, in-the-moment occasions that teachers go, whoa, yes, I'm now seeing that student show evidence of, but how do you capture that? So I believe that teachers need to be very, very sticky note in hand, clipboard in hand with students' names on them, watching all the time, taking quick notes, putting those in students' files at a later stage, and building up a history of students' listening and speaking abilities as they countenance them in the daily workings of the classroom. If they aren't recorded in some way, they'll drift out of teacher minds. So again, principals are looking to help their teachers be onto it in terms of not just assuming development of oral language skills, but having processes to capture what has been taught and therefore, we hope, what has been learned. Because we can't assume that having taught it, it has been learned. We actually want evidence of that. And we need to have some kind of recording mechanism whereby that can be done. Now, it's a little easier perhaps when we come to phonological awareness because there's a range of checklists already developed, many developed in Australia so it understands our context, though we do know of course that phonological awareness is not just Australia-centric. But there's some very good assessments around that teachers can use to check students' phonological awareness. Many of these checklists do require individualised attention to students, so it may be that we don't look at all students all at once because there's a logistic there, but certainly we look at the students who are becoming to us most problematic, so the ones who are on the radar or what I call on the forehead. They're troubling us, we're worried about them, we need to check fast and probe more deeply beyond those screening assessments. So we would pick up on those aspects that I've mentioned before about rhyming, alliteration, segmentation, blending, isolation, manipulating or exchanging. Not necessarily all at once, but we certainly want to find out enough information to get moving because we also don't want to fall into the trap of assessing and never quite finding time to tuck in the teaching because we're gathering way too much data. And we should be very judicious to get us going and then we can just do small chunks of other assessments as students learn and it's time to move on to a more sophisticated kind of learning. Now when we look at vocabulary, yes there are tests around for vocabulary but many of them are multiple choice and I'm somewhat hesitant to recommend those because there is that element of guesswork that can come into play. But what I'd be looking for is that the words that I have been teaching deliberately to students, particularly those specialised words that emerge out of the different learning areas, the Oxford word list words that have to be known, we can use checklists for those. Yes, I've heard that student speak it. Yes, I've seen that student write it. Yes, that student can now read that word in that text that they have been asked to read or that they have spontaneously chosen to read themselves. It doesn't have to be a huge assessment process of half-hour tests per child, but it does need to have some kind of recording process against it. When we move on to looking at phonics, again, let's just sort out here what we're talking about. Synthetic phonics takes the stance that we look at the smallest subsets of words and build them up. And so synthetic phonics asks us to look at students' ability to identify individual letters, to then be able to blend those letters together. So we might start with a, we then have at t, we can then go to k at t, we might then have k at t ch, and so on. That is synthetic phonics. Analytic phonics is where we start with the whole word and we look at it in terms of syllabification and onset rhyme. But let's go back to synthetic phonics because this is the doorway for many students or the door that has been closed for many students. So the phonic tests, again, there are a number of Australian developed tests around, again, not just Australian centric, but we do like to support our own writers in Australia. You'll find those phonic tests, divide those skills up into developmentally sequenced challenge, so we start with the very simple combinations and move on. But might I also say at this stage that one of the huge stumbling blocks that I've certainly found as a teacher and as an academic, but also the research would say this as well, is that many students struggle with phonics because they are yet to be able to name letters of the alphabet. It's that significant. And principals would be very canny and very, very wise to ensure that all teachers check students' abilities to name letters of the alphabet, both capital and lowercase, because it will hold them back in so many other areas of reading ability. So you might be wondering what I just said about naming a letter of the alphabet. It's absolutely essential that students are taught as quickly as possible the name of the letter and the sound, both capital and lowercase. Why is it important? Because the name of the letter never changes, though we know with our English alphabet the sound certainly does, because there's more than one sound that can be mapped onto one letter. As we move into thinking about comprehension, what we're wanting to establish is whether the strategies we have taught for reading comprehension have been picked up and are being used autonomously by students. Now, we can do that in any number of ways. Certainly when students have completed reading texts, we can ask them to retell. It's a standard and very successful teacher practice, but it's not the only one. Retelling asks students to recall what they read in the order in which they read it. And teachers can be taking notes. They can have students recording their own retells for teachers to listen to at a later stage. It can be done in any number of ways. And let's not forget teacher eavesdropping when students are talking with each other about what they've just read. What we might also consider is some kind of pencil and paper test for reading comprehension. But we need to be very careful here, because some of the published comprehension tests ask again for multiple choice response, and we can never really be confident, I believe, that they believe that A was really the right answer. Maybe they got it right by chance, maybe they truly did know, but it requires a conversation for teacher peace of mind. More importantly, I think, is the opportunity for teachers to use a range of pencil and paper products, if that's what they wish, for students to record key ideas. They're thinking about what they just read, but to be very mindful that we want students to do more reading with just enough writing for us to be reassured that they have read and understood. Coming into that as well is that big question about barking at print, because some students sound sensational when they are reading. They are moving along very fluently, the words are accurate, and we are feeling very reassured about their reading ability. However, we have enough research behind us to know, and enough teacher experience to know, that these sensational readers may actually not be understanding what they are reading. We cannot assume that getting it perfectly read will have them being able to talk about what they have read. So there needs to be follow-up at some point. It's also worthy to suggest that we need, as I've said before, to balance comprehension teaching against narrative text and against information text. Because some students can read one text type quite effortlessly, and yet when asked to read a different kind of text type, really struggle. Perhaps through lack of experience in reading it, but it might be a much more complex demand that is placed on them. So we can't assume that one type of comprehension skill will guarantee that same skill being used in a different text type. In terms of fluency, yes, there are published tests around, but be very careful of locking onto the ones that just look at rate, that is increasing words per minute, sometimes at the expense of understanding, sometimes at the expense of enjoyment, sometimes at the expense of prosody. Because if students come to the belief that they just have to read faster without using the lilt in their voice, without making attention to the punctuation and so on, then really they're getting the wrong message. So again, teacher judgment here in terms of comparisons across time, where notes are kept about what is noticed about students. There are rubrics that we can use for checking against students' fluency that are advisedly easier for teachers to use than constructing their own, but certainly can be tweaked to make it their own. So principals in support of their teachers are looking for teachers to be assessing all of these different aspects of the reading development of students, not necessarily all at once, all the time, because again we need to be judicious, but what we're looking at is what does this student need now to make them more autonomous. And yes, the sub-skills are very, very important, but they must also be given opportunities to apply those skills in the reading of connected text. And this is where, of course, comprehension and fluency is so important.